In the annals of World War II history, among the countless tales of resistance, defiance, and moral courage, one story stands apart for its sheer peculiarity and intimate betrayal. It is the story of a young man who shared the most infamous surname of the 20th century, yet chose to publicly denounce the bearer of that name. This is the story of William Patrick Hitler, the nephew who wrote an explosive article titled "Why I Hate My Uncle," and forever severed his connection to one of history's most reviled figures. The year is 1939. Europe stands on the precipice of catastrophic war. Adolf Hitler has already annexed Austria, dismembered Czechoslovakia, and set his sights on Poland. The world watches with mounting horror as the Nazi regime tightens its grip on Germany, implementing policies of persecution and preparing for continental domination. But in the pages of Look magazine, an American publication, something extraordinary appears. An article written by Hitler's own nephew, exposing family secrets, revealing personal encounters, and most damningly, publicly rejecting everything the Führer represented. To understand this remarkable act of familial betrayal, we must first understand the complex and troubled relationship between uncle and nephew, a relationship rooted in poverty, ambition, resentment, and ultimately, profound moral divergence. William Patrick Hitler was born in Liverpool, England, on March 12, 1911. His father was Alois Hitler Jr., Adolf Hitler's half-brother, and his mother was an Irish woman named Bridget Dowling. The circumstances of William Patrick's birth were themselves wrapped in controversy and family discord. Alois Hitler Jr. had left Germany years earlier, abandoning his first wife and seeking a fresh start in Ireland and later England. He met Bridget Dowling at the Dublin Horse Show in 1909, and the two quickly fell in love, marrying shortly thereafter despite her family's reservations about this mysterious German stranger. The marriage was troubled from the start. Alois was unreliable, prone to disappearing for long periods, and struggled to maintain steady employment. He worked variously as a waiter, a barber, and attempted several unsuccessful business ventures. Bridget found herself struggling to support young William Patrick, often relying on her own family for financial assistance. The household was marked by tension, arguments about money, and Alois's frequent absences. Young William Patrick grew up in working-class Liverpool, acutely aware that his father was distant, difficult, and disappointingly unsuccessful. But there was another dimension to William Patrick's childhood, one that would come to define his entire existence. His father was the half-brother of a man who, during William Patrick's youth, was transforming from an obscure political agitator into the leader of Germany's fastest-growing political movement. Adolf Hitler, the man who shared William Patrick's surname, was rising to prominence through the 1920s and early 1930s, and this fact would fundamentally alter the trajectory of William Patrick's life. In 1929, when William Patrick was 18 years old, his mother made a decision that would prove fateful. She took her son to Germany to visit his uncle Adolf. This was not entirely Bridget's idea. Young William Patrick was curious about his famous uncle, and there were also practical considerations. The family was struggling financially in Liverpool, and Bridget harbored hopes that perhaps Adolf Hitler, who was gaining wealth and influence through his political activities, might assist his nephew in finding opportunities in Germany. The first meeting between William Patrick and his uncle Adolf was reportedly cordial, but strained. Adolf Hitler, then leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, but not yet chancellor, received his nephew and sister-in-law with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Hitler was already acutely conscious of his public image and deeply concerned about his family background. He had long been embarrassed by his provincial Austrian origins, his troubled father, and the general dysfunction of his family tree. The appearance of an English nephew with a thick Liverpool accent and an Irish Catholic mother was not something he had anticipated or particularly welcomed. Nevertheless, Hitler did make some efforts to assist his nephew during this initial visit. He introduced William Patrick to various party members and suggested that the young man might find opportunities within the growing Nazi organization. William Patrick stayed in Germany for several months, learning German, observing the political movement his uncle led, and trying to understand what place, if any, he might have in this new world his uncle was creating. It was during this period that William Patrick began to form his first impressions of his uncle's character and the nature of the movement he commanded. He observed Hitler's charisma, his ability to mesmerize audiences, and his absolute conviction in his political mission. But he also witnessed the thuggery of the SA brownshirts, the atmosphere of intimidation that surrounded Nazi activities, and the violent rhetoric directed at Jews, communists, and other perceived enemies. These observations planted seeds of doubt in William Patrick's mind. Though initially his concerns were more pragmatic than moral, he was trying to survive, to find his place, to escape the poverty that had marked his childhood in Liverpool. William Patrick returned to England after this first visit, but over the next several years he would make repeated trips to Germany. His relationship with his uncle became increasingly complex and fraught. On one level, William Patrick sought to benefit from his family connection. He asked his uncle for assistance in finding employment, for introductions to influential people, and for financial support. Hitler, for his part, provided some limited help, but always grudgingly and with obvious discomfort. He found his nephew's repeated requests tiresome and worried constantly about how William Patrick's existence might complicate his carefully constructed public persona. By 1933, Adolf Hitler had become Chancellor of Germany, and the Nazi Party controlled the apparatus of the German state. The movement that William Patrick had observed in its earlier, rowdier phase was now the government. This transformed everything. William Patrick, seeing opportunity, moved to Germany with hopes of securing a significant position within the new regime. He imagined that as the nephew of the Führer, doors would open and prosperity would finally be within reach. Instead, William Patrick found himself increasingly frustrated. His uncle refused to give him any meaningful position within the government or party hierarchy. Hitler was explicit in his reasoning. He did not trust William Patrick's discretion, worried about his English upbringing and connections, and feared that his nephew might exploit their family relationship for personal gain, or worse, might share embarrassing family secrets with the press or with enemies of the regime. Hitler's concerns were not entirely unfounded. The Nazi leadership was obsessed with racial purity and Aryan ancestry, and Hitler himself had long been paranoid about potential scandals surrounding his own family background, including persistent and unsubstantiated rumors about Jewish ancestry in his family tree. William Patrick's experience in Nazi Germany between 1933 and 1939 was marked by a growing sense of disillusionment and resentment. He was given minor positions, nothing commensurate with what he believed his family connection should provide. He worked briefly at the Reichscredit Bank in Berlin, a job that his uncle had arranged but which offered little advancement and even less prestige. William Patrick grew bitter, feeling that his uncle was using him when convenient, but refusing to properly acknowledge or assist him. The relationship deteriorated further when William Patrick began making increasingly bold requests. At one point, he allegedly threatened to reveal embarrassing information about the Hitler family to the British press, unless his uncle provided him with better opportunities and financial support. This was, by any measure, an incredibly dangerous game to play. Adolf Hitler was now the absolute dictator of Germany, commanding vast security apparatus including the Gestapo and SS. Making threats against the Führer, even as a family member, was potentially fatal. Whether William Patrick actually made such explicit threats, or whether this was an exaggeration spread by Nazi officials seeking to justify their treatment of him, remains a matter of historical debate. What is clear is that by the mid-1930s, William Patrick had become a serious problem for Hitler. The Führer saw his nephew as a potential embarrassment, a security risk, and an increasingly troublesome reminder of the messy, imperfect family background he had tried so hard to obscure. Meanwhile, William Patrick was also growing morally disturbed by what he witnessed in Nazi Germany. The Nuremberg laws had been enacted in 1935, stripping Jews of citizenship and imposing severe restrictions on their lives. The atmosphere of persecution was impossible to ignore. The violence of Kristallnacht in November 1938, when Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues were destroyed across Germany, and hundreds of Jews were killed or imprisoned, shocked even those who had previously turned a blind eye to Nazi policies. William Patrick, whatever his personal ambitions and financial motivations, was not immune to the moral horror of what his uncle's regime was implementing. By 1939, William Patrick had made his decision. He would leave Germany and publicly denounce his uncle. This was not a decision made lightly. He knew that returning to England and speaking out would forever close any possibility of reconciliation with his uncle, or of benefiting from the Hitler name. He also knew that he might be placing himself in physical danger. The Nazi regime had demonstrated repeatedly that it was willing to reach beyond Germany's borders to silence critics and enemies. Nevertheless, William Patrick chose defiance over complicity. He returned to England and then traveled to the United States, where he believed he would find a receptive audience for his story. America in 1939 was not yet at war with Germany, but public opinion was increasingly turning against the Nazi regime. Stories of persecution, aggression, and Hitler's grandiose ambitions dominated newspaper headlines. Into this context came William Patrick Hitler with an offer for Look magazine. He would write an insider's account of the Hitler family, revealing personal details about his uncle and explaining why he had chosen to reject everything the Führer represented. The article, published in Look magazine in July 1939, was titled, "Why I Hate My Uncle." It was explosive, combining personal anecdotes with moral condemnation. William Patrick described his uncle as cruel, paranoid, and megalomaniacal. He recounted family gatherings, where Hitler would fly into rages over trivial matters, where he would humiliate family members, and where his obsession with power and domination was evident, even in personal interactions. William Patrick described how his uncle had refused to help his own family members, unless doing so served his political interests, how he viewed everyone, including his relatives, as potential tools or threats, but never as human beings worthy of unconditional love or support. Most damagingly, William Patrick exposed the hypocrisy at the heart of the Nazi racial ideology. He pointed out that the Hitler family tree was hardly the exemplar of Aryan purity that Nazi propaganda celebrated. He referenced rumors and family gossip about possible Jewish ancestry, about illegitimate births, about the provincial Austrian poverty from which Hitler had emerged. These revelations were designed to undermine the Führer's carefully constructed image as the embodiment of German racial superiority. The article also contained William Patrick's moral judgment of his uncle's regime. He condemned the persecution of Jews, describing it as cruel and unjustifiable. He warned that his uncle's ambitions would lead to war and catastrophe. He expressed shame at sharing the Hitler surname and declared his intention to distance himself completely from his uncle and everything he represented. This was not merely a personal grievance aired in public. It was a wholesale rejection of Nazism from someone who had the unique perspective of having known Adolf Hitler as both family member and political leader. The publication of the article created an international sensation. Here was Hitler's own nephew, someone who had lived in Germany during the Nazi rise to power, someone who had personally interacted with the Führer, publicly denouncing him in the most personal terms. The article was widely reprinted and discussed. It provided ammunition to those who opposed Hitler and the Nazi regime, offering an insider's confirmation of what many had suspected, that behind the propaganda and pageantry was a man of profound cruelty and limitless ambition. For Adolf Hitler, the article represented a deep personal humiliation. He was obsessed with loyalty and viewed betrayal as the most unforgivable sin. That his own nephew would publicly attack him, would reveal family secrets, and would align himself with Germany's enemies was infuriating. Hitler reportedly flew into a rage when informed about the article. He ordered investigations into William Patrick's activities and considered various ways to retaliate. However, by 1939, Hitler's attention was increasingly focused on preparations for war, and dealing with an embarrassing nephew in America became a lower priority compared to the conquest of Poland and the subjugation of Europe. Nevertheless, the article had consequences for other members of the Hitler family. Adolf Hitler became even more secretive about his personal life and family background. He tightened his control over information and ensured that other potential sources of embarrassing revelations were closely monitored or silenced. The incident reinforced Hitler's paranoid tendencies and his conviction that trust was a weakness that could be exploited by enemies. For William Patrick, the article marked a point of no return. He had burned his bridges completely. He remained in the United States as war broke out in Europe in September 1939. Initially, he attempted to capitalize on his notoriety, giving lectures and interviews about his famous uncle. He presented himself as someone who had seen the Nazi regime from the inside and could provide unique insights into Hitler's character and the nature of the movement he led. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, William Patrick faced a dilemma. He was living in America under his own name, William Patrick Hitler, which was both a burden and a strange form of celebrity. The American public's relationship with him was complex. He was simultaneously an object of curiosity, a useful source of anti-Nazi propaganda, and a reminder of the enemy they were fighting. William Patrick wanted to demonstrate his loyalty to his adopted country and to definitively prove that he had chosen the right side of history. In 1944, William Patrick Hitler made an extraordinary decision. He enlisted in the United States Navy. This was not a simple matter. The military authorities were deeply uncertain about allowing someone with the Hitler surname to serve, particularly in a position where he might have access to sensitive information, or where he might become a target for German propaganda or special operations. After extensive background checks and deliberations, William Patrick was accepted into the Navy, and Patrick was accepted into the Navy, assigned to serve as a pharmacist's mate. Serving in the U.S. military while bearing the name Hitler was a powerful symbolic gesture. It represented the complete inversion of what that name had come to mean. Where Adolf Hitler represented tyranny, aggression, and genocide, William Patrick Hitler, in American uniform, represented resistance to those very things. He was living proof that family names do not determine destiny, and that individuals can choose to reject evil even when it comes from their own bloodline. William Patrick served honorably during the war, though he was kept away from combat roles and sensitive positions. The Navy used his story for propaganda purposes to some extent, highlighting the fact that even Hitler's own nephew had chosen to fight against Nazism. After the war ended in 1945 with Germany's defeat and Adolf Hitler's suicide in his Berlin bunker, William Patrick Hitler faced a new question. What does one do with the name Hitler in a post-Hitler world? William Patrick's solution was to disappear. After his discharge from the Navy in 1947, he changed his name. He became William Patrick Stuart-Houston, taking his mother's surname of Stuart and combining it with Houston, a common American name. He moved to Long Island, New York, and deliberately faded from public view. He married, had children, and worked in various modest jobs, including as a lab technician. He refused nearly all requests for interviews or public appearances. He wanted to live quietly, to give his children a normal life, unburdened by the horrific legacy of their great-uncle's surname. The transformation from William Patrick Hitler to William Patrick Stuart-Houston represented the final chapter in his story of rejection and reinvention. He had begun life as the nephew of an obscure political agitator, had briefly sought to benefit from his uncle's rise to power, had grown disgusted with what that power entailed, had publicly denounced his uncle in one of the most famous articles of the pre-war period, had fought against his uncle's regime in the uniform of the United States Navy, and had finally erased even the surname that connected him to history's most infamous dictator. William Patrick Stuart-Houston died on July 14, 1987, at the age of 76. He had lived the last 4 decades of his life in deliberate obscurity, known to his neighbors and colleagues simply as Willie Stuart-Houston, a quiet man with a mysterious past that he refused to discuss. Only after his death did fuller accounts of his extraordinary life begin to emerge as historians pieced together the story of Hitler's nephew, who wrote, "Why I Hate My Uncle." The story of William Patrick Hitler raises profound questions about family, loyalty, morality, and identity. What obligation does one owe to family members whose actions are monstrous? At what point does moral responsibility override family loyalty? How does one deal with the burden of a name that has become synonymous with absolute evil? William Patrick's answers to these questions evolved over time, from initial attempts to benefit from his family connection, to growing moral discomfort, to public denunciation, to military service against his uncle's regime, and finally to the complete erasure of the Hitler name from his identity. His 1939 article, Why I Hate My Uncle, stands as a remarkable historical document. It was written at a moment when many in the West still underestimated Hitler's capacity for destruction, when appeasement was still official British policy, when the full horror of the Holocaust was yet to unfold. William Patrick's warnings about his uncle's character and ambitions would prove tragically prophetic. Within months of the article's publication, Germany invaded Poland and World War II began. Within years, millions would die in the most destructive conflict in human history and in the systematic genocide of European Jews. Could William Patrick have done more? Should he have spoken out earlier? These questions are perhaps unfair. William Patrick was young, poor, and desperate for opportunity. During the years when his uncle was consolidating power, he lacked the resources, platform, or courage to become a resistance figure from the beginning. His moral awakening was gradual, shaped by his personal experiences of being used and humiliated by his uncle, but also by his growing awareness of the evil that the Nazi regime represented. When he finally did speak out, he did so at considerable personal risk, and with full knowledge that he was ending any possibility of reconciliation or family support. The relationship between Adolf Hitler and William Patrick Hitler also reveals something about the Führer's character that is often obscured by the magnitude of his historical crimes. Hitler was not merely a monster on the world stage. He was also cruel and petty in his personal relationships. He viewed his own family members with suspicion and contempt. He was incapable of generosity or unconditional love even toward his own blood relatives. The way he treated William Patrick, refusing him meaningful assistance, while simultaneously fearing what he might reveal, demonstrates the paranoid and transactional nature of Hitler's personality. Everyone was either useful or threatening, and even family members were evaluated solely through this lens. For Adolf Hitler, William Patrick's betrayal and the publication of Why I Hate My Uncle represented a unique form of humiliation. Hitler had built his entire political identity on concepts of loyalty, blood, and racial destiny. He preached that family bonds and racial kinship were the foundation of the strong society he was creating. Yet his own nephew publicly repudiated him, rejected the Hitler name, and chose to align with Germany's enemies. This was not just a political setback or a military defeat. It was a deeply personal rejection from someone who shared his bloodline, someone who had every reason, according to Nazi ideology, to support him, but who instead chose conscience over kinship. The article's impact was amplified by its timing. In July 1939, the world was on the brink of war but not yet fully committed to opposing Hitler. William Patrick's insider account provided moral clarity at a moment when it was desperately needed. His willingness to speak out, to name his uncle's evil explicitly and personally, helped to crystallize international opinion, against the Nazi regime. While one article could not prevent the war or the Holocaust, it contributed to the broader moral consensus that Hitler and Nazism represented something that had to be opposed at all costs. William Patrick's subsequent decision to serve in the U.S. military during World War II added another dimension to his rejection of his uncle. It was one thing to write an article denouncing Hitler. It was another to actually risk one's life fighting against him. By enlisting, William Patrick demonstrated that his repudiation of his uncle was not merely rhetorical or opportunistic. He was willing to participate personally in the defeat of the Nazi regime, even though doing so meant potentially facing German forces in combat, forces that included individuals who might know about his family connection and could target him specifically. The story also illustrates the limits of family determinism and the power of individual moral choice. William Patrick Hitler was not destined to become a Nazi or to support his uncle's regime simply because of their family relationship. He made choices, some motivated by self-interest and some by genuine moral conviction, that led him away from complicity and toward resistance. His life demonstrates that individuals can transcend their family backgrounds and that the sins of one family member need not be inherited by another. In the decades after the war, as the full scope of Nazi crimes became known and the Holocaust was documented in horrifying detail, William Patrick Stuart-Houston's decision to change his name and disappear seems entirely understandable. How could one bear the name Hitler, knowing what it had come to represent? How could one ask children to grow up with that surname, to face the questions and judgment that would inevitably follow? William Patrick's choice to erase the Hitler name from his family line was a final act of rejection, a determination that his descendants would not be burdened with the legacy of their infamous relative. Yet even in his silence and obscurity, William Patrick's story continued to resonate. The very fact that Hitler's nephew had denounced him, fought against him, and ultimately erased the family name became part of the historical record, a footnote that nonetheless carries significant moral weight. It serves as a reminder that even in the darkest times, even within families touched by evil, individuals can choose differently and can stand against tyranny and hatred. The article, "Why I Hate My Uncle," remains a powerful historical artifact. Reading it today, one is struck by William Patrick's clarity about his uncle's character and the dangers he posed. One is also struck by the deeply personal nature of his grievances. This was not a political treatise written by an outside observer. It was a family member's account of betrayal, cruelty, and moral failure. William Patrick wrote about being humiliated by his uncle, about being used and discarded, but he also wrote about witnessing the human cost of Nazi policies and feeling ashamed to share the name of the man responsible. In the end, William Patrick Hitler's life story is one of transformation and moral choice. He began as an opportunist, seeking to benefit from his family connection to power. He evolved into a man who recognized evil when he saw it, even when that evil came from his own uncle. He became willing to publicly denounce that evil despite personal risk. He served actively in the military force that defeated his uncle's regime, and he ultimately chose to erase the very name that connected him to history's greatest villain, preferring obscurity and normalcy to any association with the Hitler legacy. His decision to write "Why I Hate My Uncle" in 1939 was the turning point, the moment when private grievance became public testimony, when family loyalty gave way to moral responsibility. It was an act of betrayal from Adolf Hitler's perspective, but from a broader moral standpoint, it was an act of courage and conscience. William Patrick Hitler chose the right side of history at a time when doing so cost him dearly in terms of family relationships and potential personal advancement. That choice and the article that announced it to the world stands as his most significant contribution to history and as Adolf Hitler's most personal humiliation. The nephew who looked at his uncle's rise to power and said simply and publicly, "I hate what you have become, and I will not be part of it."